Step into a Wild West saloon where wood smoke and strong coffee filled the air. Cowboys hunched over steaming son-of-a-gun stew while flapjacks sizzled in bacon, grease, and laughter followed plates of prairie oysters. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe. Today we revisit 12 unforgettable foods once served on the frontier. In the Old West, nothing spoke more about survival and resourcefulness than a bowl of son-of-a-gun stew. This hearty dish was born on cattle drives where every part of the animal was used, from tripe and heart to liver, marrow, gut, and even the brain. Trail cooks simmered these organ meats with onions, potatoes, and wild herbs in cast iron pots until the flavors melded into a thick, peppery broth. It wasn't just about taste, it was about respect for the animal and making sure no food went to waste. For saloons in cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene, the stew was cheap filling and exactly what trail-weary cowboys craved after weeks of dust and saddle sores. A steaming bowl promised warmth, calories, and the strength to keep riding. Some cowboys even joked that toughness wasn't measured by how fast you could draw a gun, but whether you could finish a full bowl of this mystery meat stew. Today, son-of-a-gun stew is remembered less for its ingredients and more for what it symbolized: grit, economy, and the cowboys' refusal to waste a single scrap when survival was on the line. Before diners and protein bars, cowboys fueled their long rides with sourdough flapjacks, thick, chewy pancakes fried in sizzling bacon grease. The secret wasn't in the flour, but in the starter, a bubbling culture of wild yeast some cowboys carried in tins tied to their saddlebags. That starter could be months old, passed down from one trail to another, treasured as if it were gold. Saloons served flapjacks any hour of the day, morning for ranch hands, midnight for gamblers stumbling from a poker table, or dawn for travelers heading back to the trail. They weren't dainty or fluffy. These flapjacks were dense sinkers that hit the stomach like a rock, but they kept a cowboy full through miles of dust and cold wind. Toppings were scarce but memorable: molasses when the rail delivered it, canned fruit when luck struck, or just a drizzle of pork drippings. For many men, that last flapjack on the plate meant a prized extra spoonful of sweetness. More than food, sourdough flapjacks were survival on a plate. Simple, hearty, and unforgettable in the smoky glow of a frontier saloon. If there was one dish that defined cowboy life, it was fried salt, pork, and beans. Nearly every saloon west of the Mississippi had it simmering on the stove, ready to fill hungry men after long hours on the trail. Salt pork preserved in heavy brine was one of the few meats that could survive weeks without spoiling. Thick slices were cut, fried in their own fat until browned and crisp, then served over pinto or navy beans that had been boiling low and slow for hours. The result was hearty, smoky, and satisfying food that stuck to your ribs and gave you the strength to ride from dawn until dusk. Sometimes cooks sweetened the pot with molasses or tossed in onions for flavor, but often it was just pork grease and beans. And yet for cowboys starved from days of jerky or hardtack, it tasted like a feast. Some saloons even kept beans available 24 hours a day, knowing no man wanted whiskey on an empty stomach. Paired with a hunk of sourdough or cornbread, fried salt, pork, and beans became more than a meal. It was comfort, community, and a reminder that even in the harsh West, simple food could feel like home. For cowboys of the frontier, coffee wasn't just a drink, it was the fuel that kept them alive. Known as six-shooter brew or liquid tar, chuckwagon coffee was boiled strong enough to float a horseshoe. Trail cooks tossed coarse grounds directly into battered tin pots of boiling water, sometimes adding eggshells or even a pinch of salt to settle the grit. In saloons, a blackened pot often sat on the stove all day, constantly topped off but rarely cleaned, filling the room with the rich, bitter scent of roasted beans. For a coin or even a few flakes of gold dust, a cowboy could get a steaming tin cup of jet black coffee, sometimes spiked with a shot of whiskey if the barkeep liked you. It wasn't delicate or refined, it was harsh, bracing, and exactly what men needed after poker games that stretched until dawn or before another ride into the cold. Chuckwagon coffee wasn't about flavor, it was about survival and ritual. In every sip was the taste of the trail, the clang of spurs on wooden floors, and the steady heartbeat of the Wild West itself. Few dishes tested a cowboy's grit like prairie oysters, better known today as Rocky Mountain oysters. Despite the name, they weren't seafood at all, but deep-fried bull testicles served hot and golden after cattle roundups and brandings. Ranching life demanded nothing go to waste, and saloon cooks turned what many would discard into a delicacy of toughness and pride. Preparation was straightforward yet daring. The organs were cleaned, sliced thin, dredged in flour and spices, and dropped into sizzling tallow until crispy outside and tender inside. In Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas, branding festivals often featured platters of prairie oysters alongside mugs of beer or rye whiskey. They were eaten with hot sauce, vinegar, or mustard, but the real flavor came from the unspoken challenge. Ordering them wasn't about hunger, it was about proving you belonged. To refuse the plate was to invite laughter, maybe even questions about your cowboy spirit. For some, the taste was surprisingly mild, almost like fried chicken, but the memory of that first bite was unforgettable. Prairie oysters weren't just food. They were a rite of passage, a salty badge of honor in the rowdy saloons of the Wild West. When beef was scarce or too expensive, cowboys often turned to what the prairie offered, and rabbit was always within reach. Light, lean, and plentiful rabbit became the backbone of countless stews simmered in frontier saloons. A cook would first brown the meat in pork fat or tallow, then slow cook it with onions, potatoes, carrots, and sometimes wild herbs until the tender meat nearly fell off the bone. In New Mexico and Arizona, saloon kitchens blended local flavors, adding chilies, garlic, and cumin, creating a stew that reflected the cultural crossroads of the West. For a weary ranch hand, the aroma alone, spicy, savory, and earthy, was enough to feel like home after weeks of dust and saddle leather. Rabbit stew wasn't the flashy dish gamblers boasted about, nor the daring challenge of prairie oysters. Instead, it was the quiet comfort food of working cowboys who longed for something warm, hearty, and familiar. Each bowl was more than nourishment. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, the West still held pockets of comfort and community around a steaming pot. Every old saloon movie seems to show a jar of cloudy eggs sitting on the counter, and for good reason. Pickled eggs were real, and they were the closest thing the Wild West had to fast food. Made in big batches, hard-boiled eggs were soaked in brine, made of vinegar, salt, mustard seeds, peppercorns, and sometimes beet juice or chili peppers for color and heat. They weren't meant to impress. They were quick, cheap, and filling the perfect snack for a cowboy too broke or too busy to order a full plate. For just a few cents, you could grab one from the jar, sprinkle on a little salt or hot sauce, and wash it down with a beer or shot of whiskey. Pickled eggs became a kind of saloon ritual, a protein-packed bite between hands of poker or a cure for an empty stomach before another round of rye. Sour, tangy, and sometimes spicy, they left a lasting punch that matched the rough edges of frontier life. To modernize, they may look strange, but for a cowboy in 1870, pickled eggs were salvation in a jar. Before cattle ranches spread across the plains, buffalo was the meat that ruled the West. Saloons and boomtowns and railway stops proudly served buffalo roast as their premium dish, a meal that carried both flavor and status. The meat, dark and lean, was closer to venison than beef, and cooks often roasted large cuts slowly over open flames or in cast iron ovens. The prized hump roast, basted with fat and herbs, was so tender it practically melted when sliced. For hungry miners or gamblers flush with winnings, buffalo roast wasn't just food, it was a celebration. A thick slice with gravy and potatoes could cost more than beef, but cowboys paid gladly for a taste of something rich and memorable. In saloons, it was the kind of dish ordered to mark a bounty collected or a lucky poker night. Sadly, the very demand that made buffalo roast so popular also helped drive the herds to near extinction by the late 1802. Today, it's remembered with both nostalgia and regret, a reminder of a time when the West was still wild and a single meal could embody both abundance and loss. For many cowboys, the simplest meals carried the deepest comfort. Biscuits and molasses were a saloon staple for men, too poor for eggs or too weary for meat. The biscuits themselves were humble, made from flour, lard, salt, and sometimes sour milk, baked quickly in a Dutch oven or skillet until crisp on the outside and flaky inside. What transformed them was the molasses, thick, dark, and sweet, poured generously over the hot biscuits like frontier syrup. Cheap to store and slow to spoil, molasses was often the only sweetness a cowboy might taste for weeks on the trail. A plate of biscuits dripping with it could revive a tired rider as much as any whiskey. In saloons, this dish was often served late at night when supplies were running low and bellies still needed filling. For many men from the South, biscuits and molasses stirred memories of childhood kitchens and family suppers long left behind. It was more than just sugar and flour. It was a reminder that even in the roughest towns of the Wild West, there was still room for a taste of home. Long before pretzels and peanuts lined bar counters, saloons in the Old West offered the ultimate cowboy snack game, jerky. Hunters brought back strips of venison, elk, or antelope, which were salted, smoked, and sun-dried until tough, chewy, and bursting with flavor. Seasonings varied. Black pepper, red pepper flakes, or wild herbs like sage gave each piece its own rustic character. Jerky wasn't just a treat. It was survival food. It didn't spoil, didn't need cooking, and could be carried in a saddlebag for days on end. In saloons, bartenders often served a small plate of jerky with pickles or cheese, a hearty pairing with a mug of beer or a shot of rye. For a few coins, a cowboy could buy a bundle to take back on the trail, wrapped in cloth and tucked away for the ride. Every strip of jerky spoke of self-reliance. You killed it, you cured it, you carried it. It was the food of hunters, riders, and wanderers who needed fuel in a land that gave nothing easily. In the glow of a saloon lantern, chewing on jerky wasn't just eating, it was participating in the rugged spirit of the frontier itself. Fresh fruit was a rare luxury on the frontier, but dried apples brought a taste of home to even the roughest saloons. Transported in sacks by wagon or rail, the slices were soaked in water to soften, then stewed with sugar, cinnamon, and nutmeg until fragrant and sweet. Poured into a thick crust of flour and lard, the pie baked in heavy cast iron pans, filling the room with a warm, spiced aroma that could stop a cowboy in his tracks. These weren't delicate pastries. The crust was dense, sturdy, and meant to endure heat and travel. But inside, the sticky, tart-sweet apple filling carried the memory of orchards far away. For a few cents, a slice of dried apple pie gave miners, ranch hands, or gamblers something rare, a taste of comfort that reminded them of family kitchens and autumn harvests. Served with nothing more than a tin fork and a quiet moment, this pie was more than dessert, it was nostalgia on a plate. In a world of dust and danger, a single bite could transport a cowboy back to simpler days and the sweetness of home. Among the rough and tumble meals of the frontier, gooseberry cobbler stood out as a rare touch of sweetness. Gooseberries, tart and tangy, grew wild across the foothills and plains. Saloon cooks gathered them when they could, stewing the berries with sugar until thick and jammy, then topping the mixture with dollops of biscuit dough. Baked in cast iron pans, the cobbler emerged bubbling and golden, its sharp flavor mellowed by the crust's warmth. Unlike dried apple pie, gooseberry cobbler wasn't about nostalgia, it was about embracing the land itself. Every bite tasted of the West, sour and bold, sweetened only by a cook's hand. Served with cream if supplies allowed, or a sprinkle of sugar if not, it quickly became a favorite among old-timers and ranch hands who grew up foraging in the wild. For a cowboy far from home, a spoonful of cobbler was a reminder that beauty still existed in harsh places. Around a noisy saloon table with boots clattering and whiskey poured, this simple dessert brought a moment of tenderness. Gooseberry cobbler was proof that even in the untamed West, sweetness found its way to the plate. These saloon dishes weren't just meals, they were survival, pride, and a taste of home on the dusty frontier. From the daring bite of prairie oysters to the sweet comfort of dried apple pie, each plate carried a story of grit and resilience. They remind us that saloons were more than whiskey halls, they were community kitchens where the Old West came alive. So which of these frontier foods would you dare to try, and which would you avoid at all costs? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nostalgic journeys.